Are you team fresh or team dried? In today's video, we're going to dive into the world of herbs, exposing the strengths and weaknesses of each type. Get ready to gain a whole new perspective on how to use herbs in all your favorite dishes.
Hi, welcome to our home kitchen and our comprehensive guide on the choice between fresh versus dried herbs from a chef's perspective. With years of culinary experience, we'll walk you through the nuances of each form, weighing their advantages and disadvantages in regards to their practicality and, most importantly, the flavor payoff. At the end, you'll have a clear understanding of when to opt for which, enhancing your culinary expertise.
Let's start with some general guidelines. Dried herbs are activated by heat and moisture. The longer the better. So therefore, if you're cooking them for a short time using heat, then you'd want to use fresh herbs. If you're cooking them for a long time, then you can opt for dry herbs.
And then if you're steeping them or just using moisture, no heat, for a short period of time, you can use fresh. And if you're steeping them for a long period of time, you can use dried.
Hardier herbs, such as rosemary, thyme, sage, they retain a lot of their flavor when they're dried. However, softer herbs such as parsley, cilantro, chives, that type of thing, they don't keep a lot of flavor when you dry them, so they're best to use fresh.
And finally, there is no downside to cooking with fresh herbs 100% of the time in terms of flavor payoff. The only issue with it is availability and the time it takes to process. So if you've got time and maybe a garden with some herbs in it, then there's no need to use dried at all. We will be using a 3-part rating system for our herbs today. The first part is value. So this is how much you get, how much it costs, how much of it you use, and how long it lasts, or the shelf life. The second part is practicality. So this is its processing time and difficulty, and how versatile it is, or how many different dishes you can use it in. And the last one is flavor payoff. So on a scale of 1 to 5, a 1 would be dried is just as good, and a 5 would be fresh is much better. Overall, if you total all 3 numbers, the higher the number, the more likely we are to recommend fresh over dried. Now let's move into specific examples of our fresh herb favorites.
So let's start with parsley and cilantro. Parsley and cilantro are readily available at the grocery store in large bunches for fairly inexpensive. They also have a fairly long shelf life when you keep them in the fridge stored properly.
Contrastingly, dried cilantro and parsley don't retain much of their flavor, and dried cilantro, in my opinion, tastes like soap. So I don't recommend getting them dried for that reason. Additionally, because they've lost so much of their flavor, you tend to have to use more in your recipes, and so you don't get as much bang for your buck when you buy them dried.
Parsley is very versatile. You can use it in a lot of recipes. You can also keep the stems and use them in your stock.
And they're not too difficult to process. You pretty much just have to wash them and then chop them up. You can keep the stems in it depending on what you're making, or like we said, you can use them for stocks.
And also parsley and cilantro both have a nice green color that you can use for garnish on your dishes. They look pretty, they taste good.
On pretty much any, I mean cilantro not anything, but
yeah,
parsley
anything.
you
can put on anything.
So parsley gets straight 5s across the board. For value, you get a lot for not very much when you buy fresh. You can use it for everything. You're good to go there. On practicality, it's not difficult to process and you can use it on any kind of dish. And for flavor payoff, I mean, it's there with fresh, it's not there with dried. So 5s across the board.
As for cilantro, we did dock 1 point for the shelf life because the leaves are quite soft, so they don't keep quite as well as parsley. And also we docked a couple points in versatility because you can't use it in everything. Not everybody likes cilantro, but cilantro just doesn't go in every dish. But flavor payoff, if you like cilantro, is 5. There's no comparison between fresh and dried.
And if you do find yourself using cilantro for a lot of different things, then ignore the practicality point. If you use it for everything, it's not going to go bad. So next we'll talk about basil. Basil can be bought in packages that look something like this at the grocery store. They're pretty expensive in my opinion, and you don't get very much with it. So depending on how much basil you use, this could be a good thing or a bad thing.
They're kind of a medium difficulty to process. You do have to pick the leaves off the stem, but that's really about it. give them a quick wash, and away you go.
In terms of flavor payoff, you absolutely get the flavor from fresh more than dried. It falls in the same soft herb category as parsley.
You can also use them while you're cooking, like earlier on in a recipe, you can simmer your basil inside your tomato sauce for a little bit longer and then put some fresh in at the end to get the fresh flavor. So you can kind of use it in two ways also. Basil also doesn't have the best shelf life because it's kind of temperature sensitive. It doesn't necessarily like to be kept in the fridge. It likes to be kept at room temperature. It does not keep as long as some of your other soft herbs even.
Basil gets a 4 for value because it comes in small packages and it's not super cheap, but you will use a lot of it. For practicality, it also gets a 4. You do kind of have to sit there and pick the leaves, but it's not that big of a pain, and you can use it in a variety of different dishes. And then for flavor payoff, just like the other soft herbs, it gets a perfect 5.
And if anybody knows why our basil plant has turned yellow out in the garden, please leave it in the comments below. It was so beautiful. We were going to have it on the table here. It was going to look nice. And in the last week or so, it's kind of sad. So if you know how to fix it, let us know.
Our basil plant let us down.
The next soft herbs that we'll talk about are mint, tarragon, and chives. We have some mint here and some chives. Generally, they come in these packages like this, but also sometimes you can get like a bunch of mint or something like that on its own. They're a little bit more expensive, and they don't have the best shelf life.
Yeah, especially the chives. I find they look like this pretty quickly. They get all soft. Anyway, for processing, I would say mint is about the same as basil. You just kind of have to pick the leaves and chop it up. Chives, so easy, so easy. You literally just cut them. It's amazing. And then tarragon I find super annoying because you have to pick all the leaves off, but it's super soft and it really bruises and gets all sticky in your hands. So I don't like processing tarragon. As soft herbs, in terms of the dried counterparts, they don't have as much flavor, definitely not. So flavor payoff is not really there.
So first we'll give tarragon our rating. First on value, we give it a 2. It's kind of expensive. You don't get a whole lot. For versatility, we give it a 3. You can use it in quite a few dishes, but it's not the most versatile herb that we'll talk about today. But still, for fresh, it gets a 5 for flavor payoff.
The price of mint varies depending on how you buy it, which could be a good thing. And because it's a bit hardier than the other herbs we've talked about, its shelf life is a bit longer. So for value, we gave it a 4. For practicality, it's pretty easy to process, but depending on how much you like it, you might not use it in very much. So for practicality, we also gave it a 4. And just like the other soft herb, its flavor payoff is perfect.
And for chives, for value, they aren't the best value. You don't get a whole lot for your money. So we gave it a 2. To process, there's nothing to it. We give it a 5. And for flavor payoff, obviously, it's a 5 also.
Next, we'll quickly skip to the only one that we would recommend always using dried, and that is bay leaves. We have a little jar right here. There's really no situation we've experienced where we would recommend using fresh over dried. The flavor payoff is pretty much the same. You get a big package, dried, and you only need to use 1 or 2. That being said, their shelf life fresh is actually very good. So if you feel so inclined, go for it. For bay leaves and value, we give it a 2 because you can get large packages for very cheap. For practicality, we've given it a 3 because it's actually just as easy to use either. It's still just a leaf, 1 leaf that you put in, same thing. And for flavor payoff, we'll give it a 1 because dried is just as good.
Next, we're going to move on to the category of it depends. So the first one that we're going to look at is thyme and rosemary. They're bought fresh in packages similar to the chives. I have some fresh rosemary here. They come in a package. They probably have more in them than you'll use, but they do have a fairly long shelf life.
Interestingly, for dried, dried is actually cheaper to buy than fresh for rosemary and thyme. And because most recipes don't need very much, you won't go through very much very quickly. As
for like the work involved in processing them, rosemary is kind of a pain. There's a lot of little leaves to pick off and the stems are quite woody. So you need to make sure that you take all the stems out. And thyme is just a real pain. The tiny little leaves on the stem, you have to pull them out. It's very tedious to get it cleaned and to process it when it's fresh.
And same with the stems. They're also woody. You really want to avoid all the stems. Because these are hardier herbs, they tend to retain more flavor when they're dried. So you can use these dried pretty easily there in terms of flavor payoff. They're also definitely in the category of herbs that you'd want to cook out or let steep for a long time so that you can extract as much of the flavor as possible.
Generally, the dishes that you'd use rosemary and thyme in are like braised dishes, like meat dishes that will cook for a long period of time. So in those cases, like we said in the beginning, you are able to use dried herbs and get a lot of flavor out of them and not have to deal with processing them and picking them and chopping them and all that. That's kind of annoying.
A couple of examples of when you may really want to opt for fresh for rosemary or thyme are, just like we said, dishes that you're not going to cook for very long. So if you're thinking like roasted veggies or even roasted potatoes, they're only in the oven for like 30 minutes or so. I would opt for fresh in those cases. Thyme and rosemary score exactly the same in all categories. For value, you get a small package for very expensive, but you don't need to use a lot. So we gave that a 3. And for practicality, it's a complete pain to process them. I hate it. So we gave that a 2 for that reason. They are quite versatile though, so that, 2. And then for flavor payoff, we gave it a 2. Like I said, there are some cases where you may want to use fresh, but for the most part, dried works just as well, and you cook those dishes for longer anyway. So.
The next herb that we're going to talk about is sage. Sage comes in the small plastic packages again, and you probably aren't going to be using a whole lot because it has an intense flavor. However, it does have a longer shelf life.
To process sage, you just have to pick the leaves, kind of like basil, but because it's a bit hardier, they're a little bit more difficult to cut. Sage is also not the most versatile herb that I've ever seen, in that I don't see very many recipes calling for it. So because you don't use it very much, it might not make sense to have dried sage available at all times, so you may be better off just buying it fresh when you need it.
So for value, we give sage a 2. You're probably not going to use a whole lot, and it comes in smaller packages. So for versatility, we give it a 3. It's not the worst to process, but it's not something that you use all the time. And the flavor payoff, it's kind of in the middle, so we've given it a 3 also.
The next herb we're going to talk about is oregano. It comes in the same package, just as expensive as the other ones. And also because of its strong flavor, just like sage, you probably won't use very much. However, being a soft herb, it does have a shorter shelf life than sage, so that's something to keep in mind as well.
It's kind of in the middle to process. It's like right between thyme and basil. It has smaller leaves that you do need to pick, so you do have to fiddle around with it a little bit. It's not super versatile, and it's not something that you'll use all the time, so you may just want to buy a package of the fresh when you use it. That way you don't have the dried one sitting in your cupboard forever and ever.
So because it comes in the same small package for pretty expensive and you don't use very much, we're giving the value a 2. For practicality, it's not that difficult to process, but again, you don't use very much, so we're putting that in the middle at 3. And its flavor payoff dried is actually fairly decent, so we're putting this one also right in the middle at 3.
The next herb that we're going to talk about is dill. Dill at the store comes in little bunches like your parsley and whatnot, and it's not particularly expensive. However, you do get quite a bit, and unless you put dill in everything, you probably won't go through it all before it goes bad. Also, it has a fairly short shelf life because the leaves get kind of slimy and not so nice if you keep it around for too long.
Dill is super easy to process though. You pretty much just cut it up. The stems are pretty tender, so you can cut those right into it, or if you want to pick it, you can, and it's not very hard. The dried version though, for a soft herb, does have pretty decent flavor payoff, so it's not too detrimental to use dried either.
So for value, we're going to give it a 4 because you get a fair amount for what you pay for it, but you might not use all of it before it goes bad, so we had to deduct a point. For practicality, we give it a 4 also because it's very easy to process. You just chop it up and it's really no work at all. However, for flavor payoff, we give it a 3. And the reason for that is because the dried actually isn't that bad, so you can use it too if you don't want to buy fresh all the time or just only have dried on hand. It's okay.
So in general, if you were to tally up all the ratings for each one, we would say that if it scores a 10 or higher, we would recommend fresh, and if it scores a 9 or lower, we would recommend dry.
So now that you've watched this video, you probably have some questions. So we've come up with some common questions that you might have.
So what if you have a recipe that calls for fresh herbs, but now you know after watching this video that you can use dried just as easily? Well, you need to know how to convert them. So the general rule of thumb here is a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning that you need 1/3 the amount dried as fresh. So if a recipe calls for 1 tablespoon of fresh herbs, you'll need about a teaspoon or 1/3 of a tablespoon or about a teaspoon of dried.
So how do you activate the flavors of dried herbs? So you need either heat or moisture to activate the flavor. So in some cases you'll have both, like in a soup, you'll be cooking it, it'll have heat and moisture. Or in some cases where you're roasting something like a piece of meat or something like that, you may only have heat. But either way, it does activate the flavor of the dried herbs.
Can I use both fresh and dried herbs in the same dish? Absolutely you can. You can definitely, like using the same principles we talked about at the beginning, you can start your cooking process, a longer cooking process, with dried herbs and then finish with fresh. Or using a steeping example, you could make a cold dip, for example, with dried herbs and then finish it with its fresh counterpart the next day. Absolutely.
How long do dried herbs last? Although they technically don't really go bad, about a year is about the longest shelf life that you want to keep them in your cupboard for. We all know that everybody has that one herb back in the back corner that's been there since we don't even know when. And in a lot of cases, you're best, even though it's not unsafe to eat, to just get rid of it because it probably doesn't have a whole lot of flavor left. So yeah, about a year, and then you should be replacing them, or just buy them in an amount that you go through in about a year. That way you don't end up keeping it forever.
Yeah, if you're in a pickle and you have some older, you know the herbs are older, but you need to use them or you want to use them for whatever reason, just keep in mind that their flavor won't be as strong anymore, so you may need to use more than the recipe calls for to make up for the lack of flavor.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, the battle of fresh versus dried herbs ultimately comes up to choice. It depends what you use them for. Some are very good used fresh, some are excellent dried, and some are good in both ways depending on what you use them for. So don't be afraid to experiment and figure out which way works for you.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the exploration of fresh versus dried herbs. If you found this video helpful, leave us a like and consider subscribing. Then we'll be back in the future with more culinary adventures. Happy cooking!